Okay, here we are again. This is going to be chapter 2 of Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. Yesterday we read chapter 1. So if you haven't seen that, definitely go take a look. This is not going to be like a typical audiobook. What we're going to do is go sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, and make sure that we understand everything that's in there. So, first we'll read it in the original, then we'll look at interesting vocabulary, and we'll pick out some interesting things and make exercises with them later in the week. So, uh, make sure that you check back on my channel so that you can practice some of the phrases and vocabulary that we learn here today. I'll probably uh, be making those exercises in a few days. Okay, so let's start with chapter 2 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. In the last chapter, Aunt Betsy had just left forever when she discovered that David Copperfield was a boy, and now he is all alone with his poor, depressed mother. All right, so chapter 2 is entitled Number 1, I observe. I observe. Now, there's a little bit of a problem with the first few words. So it says the, and I can't read that word, objects. So the something objects that assume a distinct presence before me as I look far back into the blank of my infancy are my mother, with her pretty hair and youthful shape, and Peggotty, with no shape at all, her eyes so dark that she seemed to darken their whole neighborhood in her face and cheeks and arms, so hard and red that I wondered the birds didn't pick her in preference of apples. Okay, so let's see. The something objects that assume a distinct presence before me as I look far back into the blank of my infancy are my mother. So he's saying that the few things that I remember about being so young, obviously not a baby, are his mother and her youthful shape and her pretty hair, and Peggotty, the servant, with no shape, and her eyes so dark that they seemed to darken their whole neighborhood in her face. The cheeks and arms so hard and red that I wondered the birds didn't peck her. As birds, when they move their head and hit something with their beaks, that's pecking. Peck her in preference to apples. So he's saying her cheeks were so red, he wondered why the birds didn't attack her face, thinking that they were apples, or better than apples. Oh, by the way, if you happen to watch this live, then please feel free to ask questions and ask me to explain something. So I'm just right now there's nobody watching, so I'm just explaining things where I think you might have questions. But it's better if you're watching and you can actually ask the questions. I believe I can remember these two at little distance apart, dwarfed to my sight by stooping down or kneeling on the floor, and I going unsteadily from the one to the other. So I believe I can remember these two at little distance apart, dwarfed to my sight by dwarf means to become small or make small. Dwarfed to my sight. So he's imagining, he kind of remembers Peggotty and his mother going down to the floor, so they made themselves smaller, dwarfed to his sight by stooping down. Stooping down is when you make yourself small. Let me see. Maybe it's time to look at a couple of pictures here. Stooping. What kind of pictures can we get with stooping? All right, here's a good example. Let's say that this could be considered stooping. This man, he's in the standing up position, the bending over position, and that final position is maybe stooping down. Yeah, they're calling it crouching here. Stooping, crouching, and standing. So the final one, the last picture, is like stooping down. So he remembers Peggotty and his mother stooping down. And what happened? Let's see. I believe I can remember these two at little distance apart, dwarfed to my sight. Oh, let's put that up here. I'm just looking for. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Let's put dwarfed. Dwarf as a verb means that something is made to look small. So usually when you say something is dwarfed, it means there are other things around it which are very big. So this one thing, even if it isn't big, looks small. Let's see. What kind of picture do we get if we have the word dwarfed? Okay, here, like this. See, this woman is very tiny. She's very small. And this man is very tall. So that doesn't look like a, it's not a real picture. But you could say the man is so tall that he dwarfs, or he dwarves the woman. He makes the woman look small. So that's how you can use dwarf. Whoops. Well, one of these days I'll get used to using this thing. Okay, so I believe I can remember the two at little distance apart, dwarfed to my sight. They made themselves look small so that he could see them face to face. By stooping down or kneeling on the floor. So stooping down is like that picture we saw, like bending over. Okay. And I going unsteadily from one to the other. So steady, when you say steady, that means very straight or very direct. But when he says unsteadily, that means he's very uneasy walking. So if he's walking in an unsteady way because he's just a baby. Okay, let's see. So I going unsteadily from one to the other, going from his mother to Peggotty in an unsteady manner. I have an impression on my mind which I cannot distinguish from actual remembrance of the touch of Peggotty's forefinger as she used to hold it out to me, and of its being roughened by needlework, like the pocket of a nut, like a pocket nutmeg grater. Oh gosh. Okay, well, let's see. Forefinger. Let's see which one is the forefinger. Oh, that's the index finger. So we usually would say the index finger here. Let me show you a picture of what is meant by the forefinger. So here's the forefinger. So he remembers Peggotty's forefinger. He thinks he remembers Peggotty's forefinger. Whoops. Oh my. Okay. And what did he say about it? That she used to hold it out to me. So when he was a baby, she used to hold out her finger so that he could grab it. And it was roughened by needlework, like a pocket nutmeg grater. All right, let's see. Let's have a look at nutmeg. I like nutmeg. This is nutmeg. And a nutmeg grater. Let's just find a grater here. This is a grater. So a nutmeg grater. Okay, let's see here. Okay, this may be fancy, So again, remember that fancy means like fantasy. So sometimes, yes, you probably know the word fancy, meaning expensive or pretty or something like that. But here, fancy means imagination. This may be my imagination. Maybe this didn't really happen. This may be fancy, though I think the memory of most of us can go farther back into such times as many of us suppose. Well, let's look at that again. This may be fancy, though I think the memory of most of us can go farther back into such times that many of us suppose. So he's saying, maybe it's my imagination, but I really do think I remember this as a small baby. That's what he means by that. Just as I believe the power of observation in numbers of very young children to be quite wonderful for its closeness and accuracy. Indeed, I think that most grown men who are remarkable in this respect may, with greater propriety, be said not to have lost the faculty than to have acquired it. So he's saying people who are math geniuses or numbers geniuses now, maybe they didn't acquire that. Maybe they didn't become smart by studying. Maybe they just never forgot how to do it when they were children. Okay, as I generally observe, such men to retain a certain freshness and gentleness and capacity of being pleased, which are also an inheritance they have preserved from their childhood. So he's saying that these geniuses, these math geniuses, he's noticed have some very childlike qualities about them. So maybe there are several things that they haven't forgotten from their childhood. I might have a misgiving that I am meandering. Now, in the last chapter, we talked about this word meander, which means going from place to place, walking from place to place with no special direction or no destination in mind. That's meandering. And maybe we'll write that up here. Let's see. Meandering. So it's not necessarily a good thing if you're meandering. It means that you have no destination, you have no goals. When somebody accuses you of meandering, it sounds like you don't have any place to go. But here, he's using it when he's talking. So it means changing subjects. Like maybe I'm meandering, maybe I'm going from one subject to another without any specific goal in mind. So that's meandering. So I might have a misgiving that I'm meandering. So he's thinking to himself, maybe I'm meandering, maybe I'm changing subjects, maybe I'm boring you in stopping to say this. But that it brings me to the remark that I build these conclusions in part upon my own experience of myself. And if it should appear from anything I may set down in this narrative, that I was a child of close observation, or that as a man I have a strong memory of my childhood, I undoubtedly lay claim to both of these characteristics. That's kind of complicated. Let's see. Let's read it again and try to figure out what he's saying. I might have a misgiving that I am meandering in stopping to say this, but so he's saying, I don't really want to say this, but I'm going to anyway. I don't want to say this because you're going to think that I'm changing the subject. But that it brings me to remark that I build these conclusions in part upon my own experience of myself. So he's saying, this is my own experience. This is what I remember. And if it should appear from anything I may set down in this narrative, set down kind of means write here, that I was a child of close observation, or that as a man I have a strong memory of my childhood, I undoubtedly lay claim to both of these characteristics. So he's saying, yeah, I paid very close attention to things when I was a child. I was a child of close observation. And even now I have a very strong memory of my childhood. And he's saying, yeah, that's true. Okay, but that's his meandering. Looking back, as I was saying, into the blank of my infancy, the first objects I can remember as standing out by themselves from the confusion of things that are my mother and Peggotty. What else do I remember? Let me see. So, looking back, as I was saying, into the blank of my infancy, the first objects I can remember as standing out by themselves from a confusion of things are my mother and Peggotty. So, those are the first things that he can remember, his mother and Peggotty. What else do I remember? Let me see. Standing out means being separate or being noticeable. That's a phrasal verb, standing out. And in the text, let's see, looking back, as I was saying, into the blank of my infancy, the first objects I can remember as standing out by themselves. So maybe everything was just one big picture to him, but the things that he first noticed as being separate from the background, the most noticeable things were his mother and Peggotty. They stood out. They became separate from everything else. Very noticeable, very easy to see. What else do I remember? Let me see. There comes out of the cloud or house, not new to me, but quite familiar in its earliest remembrance, on the ground floor of Peggotty's kitchen, opening into the backyard, with a pigeon house on a pole, in the center, without any pigeons in it. A great dog kennel in a corner, without any dog, and a quantity of fowls that looked terribly tall to me, walking about in a meandering and ferocious manner. So there's that word meandering again. That's our word of the day. So he remembers the birds, fowls. He remembers the fowls, these birds, meandering. So they're just going. They're not looking for anything. They're just walking around because they have nothing else to do. They're meandering. Oh, let's see. So on the ground floor is Peggotty's kitchen, opening into a backyard, with a pigeon house on a pole in the center without any pigeons in it, and a great dog kennel in a corner without any dog, and a quantity of fowls that looked terribly tall to me, walking about in a menacing and ferocious manner. Oh, did he say menacing? I thought he said meandering. Oh, menacing. Menacing is like scary. Let's see if we can find a word here. Menacing. I don't know. Looks like somebody's logo is menacing. Let's just put that word up here. Menacing. So menacing is a word that means like, oh, this looks like it's going to hurt me. It means it's kind of a synonym of threatening. If something is menacing, it looks like it's about to hurt you. Let's see. Maybe you could say that this is menacing. Something out there that looks like it's going to hurt you is what menacing means. Okay. Menacing and ferocious manner. There's one cock gets upon a post to crow, and seems to take particular notice of me as I look at him through the kitchen window. So a cock is a male rooster, or a male chicken, a rooster. There is one cock who gets upon a post to crow. Crowing is the sound of that's crowing, and seems to take a particular notice of me as I look at him through the kitchen window. Who makes me shiver? He's so fierce. Shivering is like this. Ooh, that's shivering. So you might shiver when you're cold. Ooh, it's shivering cold outside. But here, this is shivering with fear or nervousness. Ooh, that's scary. He's so fierce. Of the geese outside the side gate, who come waddling after me with their long necks stretched out when I go that way, I dream at night as a man environed by wild beasts might dream of lions. Let's see. Waddling. Waddling is a type of walking, and here's an example of waddling. This penguin is waddling. He's walking, but it's a funny kind of side-to-side walk, and that's waddling. Right, so there's one cock who gets upon a post to crow and seems to take particular notice of me as I look at him through the kitchen window, who makes me shiver. He's so fierce. Of the geese outside the side gate, who come waddling, that's how geese would walk, after me, with their long necks stretched out when I go that way, I dream at night as a man environed by wild beasts might dream of lions. So these animals are in his dream. In his dreams, he dreams about them. Okay, let's see. Here is a long passage. What an enormous perspective I make of it, leading from Peggotty's kitchen to the front door. A dark storeroom opens out of it, and that is a place to be run past at night. Here is a long passage. So, like, here is a long hallway. What an enormous perspective I make of it, leading from Peggotty's kitchen to the front door. A dark storeroom opens out of it. So there's a long, scary, dark hallway, and in it there's a little room where they keep things, maybe food and things like that. And that is a place to be run past at night. So he's afraid of that place. He's afraid of going past that storeroom in the long hallway. For I do not know what may be among those tubs and jars and old tea chests, when there's nobody in there, with a dimly burning light, letting a moldy air come out at the door. Now that word dim, let's see what kind of things we can find for that. Dim. Dim means very little light. So dim, there's some light, but not very much. So, for example, here you have a dim room. This is dim. That's a dim room, a dim light, or perhaps like that. That's dim. So there's light, but it's not a lot of light. It's very little light. So the hallway was dim. It wasn't dark. Well, I mean, that is kind of dark, isn't it? But there was a little bit of light. You could see some things. So let's see. So I do not know what may be among those tubs and jars and old tea chests when there's nobody in there with a dimly burning light. So if you go into that storeroom, you'll see tubs and chests. Let's see. Let's take a look at tub. A tub could be something like this. Whoops, that's not a tub. Something like this is a tub, and a chest, something like this. No, not that kind of chest. Wait a minute. Different chest. So these are chests. Chests and tubs. Let's see. For I do not know what may be among those tubs and jars. Oh, we forgot jars. Let's take a look at jars. Here's a jar. These are jars. Whoops, I keep selecting the wrong thing. Okay. For I do not know what may be among those tubs and jars and old tea chests, when there's nobody in there with a dimly burning light, letting a mouldy air come out at the door, in which there is the smell of soap, pickles, pepper, candles, coffee, and all of that, all at one whiff. Okay, wait, let's see. Moldy. Let's take a look at what moldy is. This is moldy. Moldy, moldy, moldy. Okay, for I do not know what may be among those tubs and jars and old tea chests, when there is nobody in there with a dimly burning light, letting the moldy air come out at the door, in which there's the smell of soap, pickles, pepper, candles, and coffee, all at one whiff. A whiff is like a smell. It's like a smell. I gotta tell my dog to stop making all that noise. Okay. Then there are the two parlors. The parlor in which we sit and sit of an evening. What? Let's try that again. Then there are two parlors. The parlor in which we sit of an evening. That's a strange phrase. My mother and I and Peggotty, for Peggotty is quite our companion when her work is done and we are alone. And the best parlor where we sit on a Sunday, grandly, but not so comfortably. There is something of a doleful air about the room to me, for Peggotty has told me, I don't know when, but apparently ages ago, about my father's funeral and the company having their black cloaks put on. One Sunday night, my mother reads to Peggotty and me in there how Lazarus was raised up from the dead, and I am so frightened that they are afterwards obliged to take me out of bed and show me the quiet churchyard out in the bedroom window, with the dead all lying in their graves at rest below the solemn moon. There is nothing half so green that I know anywhere as the grass of the churchyard, nothing half so shady as its trees, nothing half so quiet as its tombstones. The sheep are feeding there. When I kneel up, early in the morning, in my little bed, in a closet within my mother's room, I look out at it, and I see the red light shining on the sundial. And I think to myself, is the sundial glad, I wonder, that it can tell me the time again? Here is our pew in the church. So a pew is this. This is a pew. Just a second. Sometimes I just like to check and make sure that I'm still live. I have this weird voice in my head saying you have to check. Okay. So that's a pew, and now he's going to describe the pew. Here is our pew in church. What a high-backed pew, with a window near it, out of which our house can be seen, and is seen many times during the morning service by Peggotty, who likes to make herself as sure as she can that it's not being robbed or is not in flames. But though Peggotty's eye wanders, now remember we have that word meandering, which means going from place to place with no direction. And wander is a very similar word. Wander also means to, or maybe we'll put that word up here, to wander. So wander also means going from place to place without thinking of any destination. And here they're using it to mean wandering. Her eye wanders, which means she should be looking straight ahead, but sometimes her eye kind of goes like this, and she looks out of the side, and these are wandering eyes. But though Peggotty's eyes wander, so she's not always concentrating. Sometimes her eyes go from here to there, not looking at anything in particular. She is much offended if mine does. So sometimes she moves her eyes around, but if he looks away from the sermon, from the church, she gets angry with him. And frowns to me. So she shows that she's unhappy, that he isn't looking. She is much offended if mine does, and frowns to me as I stand upon the seat, that I am to look at the clergyman. But I can't always look at him. I know him without the white thing on, and I'm afraid of his wondering why I stare so. I know him without that white thing on, and I'm afraid of his wondering why I stare so, and perhaps stopping the service to inquire. And what am I do? That's kind of a strange sentence. So he's saying, let's see, clergyman. So if we look at a clergyman, he says, I know him without that white thing on. So you see that white collar on his neck. I think what he's saying is, I know him outside of church, which is kind of weird for him. That maybe he visits the mother socially, and so that makes an uncomfortable. He knows him in two different ways, as the head of the church, but also as a person. So he has like these real life fantasies about him, like, what are you doing, David? Like he's going to stop the church sermon to say, what are you doing? Okay, let's see. Wondering why I stare so, and perhaps stopping the service to inquire. It's a dreadful thing to gape. Gaping is like a strong a look with your mouth open. That's gaping. But I must do something. I look at my mother, but she pretends not to see me. I look at a boy in the aisle, and he makes faces at me. Making faces is, making funny faces. He makes faces at me. I look at the sunlight coming in at the open door through the porch, and there I see a stray sheep. Now that word stray, that's a good word to know. Stray means that you are not in the proper place. So, for example, let's take a look at, let's see. I look at this dog. Dogs live with humans most of the time. So when you see a dog not living with a human, they seem to not be in the proper place. They should be in someone's home. And so we call this a stray dog, a dog not in the proper place, especially in a city. If you see these dogs in a city, they really don't belong living in a city. They should at least be living in someone's home or in the country. So that's a stray dog. And how do they use stray here? Where was it? The boy in the aisle makes faces at me. I look at the sunlight coming up. I look at the sunlight coming in at the open door through the porch. And there I see a stray sheep. So, a sheep is what is the proper place for a sheep? Should be on a farm, not at the entrance of the church. So that's why he's calling it a stray sheep. That sheep is not in the place where it's supposed to be. So I look at the church door and I see a stray sheep. I don't mean a sinner. You can use stray to mean also like you're not following the rules of the religion. So if somebody goes astray, that means they're doing bad things. They're doing bad things against the religion. And sometimes people in a church are referred to as sheep. And the head of the church is the pastor, the person who manages the sheep. So so when he says I look out the door and I see a stray sheep, I don't mean a sinner. I don't mean somebody who isn't following the religion properly. I mean a real animal, a stray sheep, mutton. But mutton, half making up his mind to come in the church. I feel that if I looked at him any longer, I might be tempted to say something out loud. And what would become of me then? I look at the monumental tablets on the wall and try to think of Mr. Bodgers, late of this parish, and what the feelings of Mrs. Bodgers must have been when affliction sore long time, but Mr. Bodgers bore, and physicians were in vain. No, that's a really complicated sentence. Wait. So I look up at the monumental tablets on the wall and try to think of Mr. Bodgers, late of this parish. That phrase, late of this parish, means that he lived in the community and he's dead. Let's see. And what the feelings of Mrs. Bodgers must have been when affliction, sore, long time, Mr. Bodgers bore. Well, affliction means like sickness, but this, when affliction sore, long time, Mr. Bodgers bore, and Mr. Bodgers tolerated it. He had this horrible sickness, but he managed it. And physicians were in vain, and the doctors couldn't do anything about it. I wonder whether they called in Mr. Chillip. That was the doctor who delivered him. And he was in vain. And if so, how he likes to be reminded of it once a week. I look from Mr. Chillip in his Sunday neckcloth to the pulpit and think what a good place it would be to play in, and what a castle it would make with another boy coming up the stairs to attack it, and having the velvet cushion with the tassels thrown down at his head. In time, my eyes gradually shut up, and from seeming to hear the clergyman singing a drowsy song in the heat, I hear nothing until I fall off the seat with a crash, and I'm taken out, more dead than alive, by Peggotty. So he falls asleep, and then he crashes to the floor, and Peggotty is very angry and drags him out. And now I see the outside of our house with the latticed bedroom windows standing open. Latticed. Let's just take a look at that word for a minute. Latticed. This is a lattice. And a latticed window is something like this. That's a latticed window. So he's describing part of his house, and he mentions the latticed window. And now I see the outside of our house with the latticed bedroom windows standing open to let in the sweet-smelling air, and the ragged old rook's nests still dangling from the elm trees at the bottom of the front garden. Dangling. That is a word that we should talk about here. Let's see. Dangling. Right, dangling is a kind of like a hanging, like this. Let's see what kind of pictures, if I do dangle, what kind of pictures can we get? Oh, that's not going to help. Let's see. Okay, here's one. This is Homer dangling. I guess it also happens to be a name. So we get a lot of these things about dangle, but it's a name. So this is dangling. The shoe is dangling. Okay. How are we using dangling here? Let's go back and find it. Oh, the nests, the birds' nests were dangling from the trees. Okay. So you can imagine these old birds' nests kind of hanging from the trees and moving. Okay, now I'm at the garden, and beyond the yard, the empty pigeon house, the dog kennel, are a very preserve of butterflies. Okay, so the old pigeon house where there are no pigeons, and the dog house where there are no dogs. Butterflies have made a lot of butterflies have made their homes there. As I remember it, with high fence and a gate and a paddock, were the fruit clusters on the trees, riper and richer than the fruit has ever been since in any other garden, and where my mother gathers some in a basket, while I stand by, bolting furtive gooseberries and trying to look unmoved. A great wind rises, and the summer is gone in a moment, and we are playing in the winter twilight, dancing about the parlor. When my mother is out of breath and rests herself in an elbow chair, I watch her winding her bright curls round her fingers. Let's see if we can get something about winding here. Let's see. To wind. Let's see. Winding is like a circular motion. Let's see if we can find a good example. Maybe you could call this a winding road. See, it's like the movement of a circle. I'm not sure why that's a picture of winding. Let's see. See, this guy is winding the old record player. That's winding. Now, his mother, he remembers his mother winding her hair. So she's sitting there playing with her hair, doing this. And that's winding her hair. My mother is out of breath and rests herself in the elbow chair. I watch her winding her bright curls round her fingers and straightening her wrist. And nobody knows better than I do that she likes to look so well and is proud of being so pretty. This is among my earliest impressions, that and a sense that we were both a little afraid of Peggotty, and submitted ourselves in most things to her direction, were among the first opinions, if they may be so called, that I derived from what I saw. So Peggotty is the servant, but the mother was very young and inexperienced, and Peggotty was much older. So she was kind of in charge of the house. She was kind of the mother of the house, even though she was the servant. And they both listened to her and whatever she said. Peggotty and I were sitting one night by the parlor fire, alone. I had been reading to Peggotty about crocodiles. I must have read a very perspiciously... What is that word? Perspicious? What does that mean, perspicious? I've got to check that. That's not a word that I think you'll ever have to know. I've never used it. Perspicious. Perspicuous. It's not perspicious, it's perspicuous. clearly expressed and easily understood. So very clear. Don't worry about that word. I don't think anybody would ever know what you're talking about. Peggotty and I were sitting one night by a parlor fire alone, and I had been reading to Peggotty about crocodiles. I must have been very perspicuously, or I must have read very perspicuously, so clearly and easily understood. Or the poor soul must have been very deeply interested, for I remember she had a cloudy impression after I had done, that they were a sort of vegetable. I was tired of reading and dead sleepy, but having leave as a high treat to sit up until my mother came home from spending the evening at a neighbor's, I would come home. I would rather have died upon my post, of course, than gone to bed. There's something weird here. I had been reading to Peggotty about crocodiles. I must have read very perspicuously, or the poor soul must have been very deeply interested, for I remember she had a cloudy impression after I had done that they were a sort of vegetable. So I'm not sure I understand what that means. I must have been very clear, and maybe it's sarcasm, because he's saying I must have read very, very clearly. It must be very easy for her to understand what I'm reading, because it seemed like she was interested, but when I was finished, she thought I was reading about vegetables. So I think what he's saying in a sarcastic way is she was very distracted. I was tired of reading and dead sleepy, but having leave as a high treat to sit up until my mother came home. So he was tired and he wanted to go to bed, but this one time he was allowed to not go to sleep and wait for his mother to come home. She was at a party. Spending the evening at a neighbor's. I would rather have died upon my post, of course, than to go to bed. So he definitely wanted to stay and wait for his mother, and he would have preferred death than falling asleep. I had reached that stage of sleepiness when Peggotty seemed to swell and grow immensely large. I propped my eyelids open with my 2 forefingers and looked preservingly at her as she sat at work, at the little bit of wax. Okay, so I guess this is an illustration. Oh, this is the pew at church. How do they draw that picture? So here's the sermon, the clergyman. And where's David? No, I don't think that you can see David in this picture. Oh well. Let's see. How does it stop? At the little bit of, let's see. I propped my eyelids open with my forefingers and looked perseveringly at her as she, perseveringly, and looked perseveringly. To persevere. Oh, that's a good word. Let's put that here. To persevere. To persevere is the opposite of giving up. So if you persevere, that means you fight and you don't give up. So he really wants to go to sleep. His body is making him go to sleep, but he's fighting it. He's persevering. So he looked up at her, persevering, like, no, I'm not going to sleep, as she sat at work, at that little bit of wax. At that little bit of wax candle she had got for her thread. How old it looked, being so wrinkled in all directions, at the little house with the thatched roof, where the yard measure lived, at her workbox with a sliding lid, with a view of St. Paul's Cathedral, with a pink dome painted on top, at the brass thimble on her finger, at herself, whom I thought lovely. I felt so sleepy. Oh, I can't talk. I felt so sleepy that I knew if I lost sight of anything for a moment, I was gone. So he was just focusing on all of the things around him to try and stay awake. And he was focusing on the thread that she was using to sew and how old it looked being so wrinkled in all directions. Uh, I think he's talking about the candle there. At the little house, uh, it to me, I think, I'm not sure, but it sounds like what he's describing is a sewing kit. So sewing is when you repair something, and oh wait, let's find antique sewing kit. So I mean, that was a very common thing for people to do at night: sew, repair clothes, or make clothes. And so an old sewing kit might look something like this. But probably the outside of the box was very nicely decorated, and I think that he is describing the outside of the box. That's what I think. I'm not really sure. He doesn't say. He just starts describing things. And he's talking about the lid of something, so it's probably this. Yeah, her work box, her sewing kit. So he's describing what he sees on the sewing kit on the work box. Okay, now he says, "Peggotty," says I, suddenly, "were you ever married?" And she answers, "Oh, Lord, Master Davy," replied Peggotty, "what put marriage in your head?" She answered with such a start that it quite awoke me. So she was so surprised by that question, the way she answered, she was so surprised that it woke him up. He wasn't in that sleeping state anymore. And then she stopped in her work and looked at me with her needle drawn out to its thread length. I'm just going to take a little break. I'll be back in 1 minute. All right, we're back. Let's keep going. Okay, so she answered with such a start that it quite awoke me, and then she stopped in her work and looked at me with her needle drawn, its thread with her needle drawn out to its thread's length. "But were you ever married, Peggotty?" says I. "You're a very handsome woman, ain't you? Aren't you?" I thought her in a different style from my mother, certainly, but of another school of beauty. I considered her a perfect example. So yeah, he understood that she wasn't pretty like his mother, but he still thought that she was pretty. There was a red velvet footstool in the best parlor on which my mother had painted a nosegay. What's a nosegay? I have no idea. Let's see what a nosegay is. It's probably some kind of bird. No, it's a bouquet of flowers. So a nosegay is like this. I don't think it's a word that you ever have to know, but I guess it's an interesting word. So there was a footstool, and his mother painted a bouquet of flowers, a nosegay, on it. Okay, and oh, I lost my music. What happened to my music? Let's bring the music back. Okay. There was a red velvet footstool in the best parlor on which my mother had painted a nosegay. The groundwork of that stool and Peggotty's complexion appeared to me to be one and the same thing. The stool was smooth, and Peggotty was rough, but that made no difference. "Me handsome, Davy?" said Peggotty. "Lawk, no, my dear. But what put marriage in your head?" "I don't know. You mustn't marry more than one person at a time, may you, Peggotty?" "Certainly not," says Peggotty, with the promptest decision. "But if you marry a person and the person dies, why then you may marry another person, mayn't you, Peggotty?" "You may," said Peggotty, "if you choose, my dear. That's a matter of opinion." "But what is your opinion, Peggotty?" said I. I asked her and looked curiously at her because she looked so curiously at me. "My opinion is," said Peggotty, taking her eyes from me after a little indecision, "that hi, Antonio. Thanks for the message. This is a little experiment I'm trying, reading a book live." Okay, let's see. I asked her, "But what is your opinion, Peggotty?" said I. I asked her and looked curiously at her, and she looked curiously at me. Uh, "My opinion is," said Peggotty, taking her eyes from me after a little indecision and going on with her work, "that I never was married myself, Master Davy. And I don't expect to be. That's all I know about the subject." "You ain't cross, I suppose, Peggotty, are you?" said I, after sitting quiet for a minute. Cross is another word for angry. So he's saying, "Are you angry? Are you angry that I'm asking you this kind of a question?" I really thought she was. She had been so short with me. But I was quite mistaken, for she said she laid aside her work. That means she put her work to the side, which was a stocking of her own. So she was sewing up a stocking that she had, and opening her arms wide, took my curly head within them and gave me a good squeeze. So she grabbed me and squeezed me. I know it was a good squeeze because being very plump, plump is kind of a nice way of saying fat. Plump is kind of like a good fat. So when you say somebody is plump, it isn't supposed to be an insult. It's supposed to be cute or nice. Being very plump, whenever she made any little exertion after she was dressed, some of the buttons on the back of her gown flew off. And I recollect it two bursting to the opposite side of the parlor while she was hugging me. So she's a big woman, and when she hugged him, some of the buttons popped off from the back of her dress and flew off. Now let me hear some more about the crocodils, said Peggotty, who was not quite right in the name yet, for I ain't heard half enough. So she's saying, read to me some more. I couldn't quite understand why Peggotty looked so queer, or why she was so ready to go back to the crocodiles. However, we returned to those monsters with fresh wakefulness on my part, and we left their eggs in the sand for the sun to hatch. And we ran away from them and baffled them by constantly turning. What? And we ran away from them and baffled them by constantly turning, which they were unable to do quickly on account of the unwieldy make. And we went into the water after them, and natives put sharp pieces of timber down their throats. And in short, we ran the whole crocodile gauntlet. Okay. So I guess he's in a way, he's explaining what's in the book that he's reading. But he's doing it in a way that is like in the first person, his own direct experience. Obviously they didn't, they were just reading. So let's read that again. However, we returned to those monsters with fresh wakefulness on my part. So now I was fully awake, I wasn't tired anymore. And we left their eggs in the sand for the sun to hatch. So part of the book is explaining how crocodile babies are born. And we ran away from them and baffled them by constantly turning, which they were unable to do quickly. So they were being chased, in his imagination, I guess. They were being chased by crocodiles. And then we have this verb, to baffle, which means to confuse. So he says, we ran away from them and baffled them by constantly turning. So they would turn this direction and that direction, and that confused them because their bodies are so long, it's not easy for them to turn, apparently, according to this book that he's reading. Okay. Which they were unable to do quickly on account of their unwieldy make. To wield something, let's see if we can find a picture of that. Let's see. To wield is to... I'm spelling it wrong. That's why I can't find it. To wield something is to move something around. So, for example, here, it kind of means like to manipulate. So, for example, here we've got this man is wielding a weapon. You usually use it when you're talking about some kind of weapon, like maybe a sword or something like that. He's wielding a sword. He's holding it and moving it around. That's wielding. Unwieldy means can't move around, too difficult to move around, maybe too heavy, or maybe a strange shape. But that's what unwieldy means. And so he's saying that it was easy to escape from the crocodiles because we could move very quickly in any direction. But the crocodile is unwieldy. Now I think we better use that word. Let's see, unwieldy. Unwieldy. Is that right? I-E? Yes. Okay. So unwieldy, that means difficult to move, difficult to manipulate. And he says that the crocodiles are unwieldy. The shape of their body is so strange, it's not easy for them to move quickly in some direction. They're unwieldy. They can't move around easily. Okay. So let's see. We went into the water after them, as natives, and put sharp pieces of timber down their throats. And in short, we ran the whole crocodile gauntlet. To run the gauntlet of something, that's a good expression, to run the gauntlet. Run the gauntlet. That's an expression which means we did all of the things. I guess is the easiest way to explain it. So when you run the gauntlet, you go from A to Z. You do everything in between, running the gauntlet. So he's describing these crocodile adventures, and he described every situation: eggs, running, every situation you can imagine with a crocodile. They ran the crocodile gauntlet. All right, let's see. I did at least, but I had my doubts of Peggotty, who was thoughtfully sticking her needle into various parts of her face and arms all the time. I did at least. So it seems Peggotty was distracted. She wasn't really listening. She was worried about something else. But he remembers the story. He was paying attention. It was interesting to him. We had exhausted the crocodiles and begun with the alligators when the garden bell rang. We went out to the door, and there was my mother, looking unusually pretty, I thought, and with her gentleman, with the beautiful black hair and whiskers, who had walked home with us from church last Sunday. As my mother stooped down, remember stooping is just a reminder. I don't remember if we added that, so I'm going to add it again just in case. To stoop down. Earlier he was talking about how Peggotty and his mother made themselves small so that he was a little baby and they went down to the floor so they could all be at the same level. And stooping down is something like this. This is stooping down. Or maybe something like this. Whoops. Stooping down. Something like that. Well, here in this picture, they show stooping as the biggest of the movements. Well, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. So you've got stooping and squatting and kneeling. All right. So who was stooping down and why? Let's see. As my mother stooped down on the threshold to take me in her arms, so he came out of the house and she came down to pick him up. She stooped down to pick him up. On the threshold to take me in her arms and kiss me, the gentleman said I was more highly privileged little fellow than a monarch, or something like that. For my later understanding comes, I'm sensible to my aid here. For my later understanding comes, I am sensible to my aid here. I'm not really sure what he means by that. Let's keep going though. What does that mean? I asked him over her shoulder. And he patted me on the head. He patted me on the head. But somehow I didn't like him or his deep voice, and I was jealous that his hand should touch my mother's in touching me, which it did. I put it away as well as I could. "Oh, Davy," remonstrated my mother. "Dear boy," said the gentleman, "I cannot wonder at this devotion." I never saw such a beautiful color on my mother's face before. She gently shied me for being rude. So chiding, that's like shame on you. And keeping me close to her shawl, turned to thank the gentleman for taking so much trouble as to bring her home. She put out her hand to him as she spoke, and as she met it with his own, she glanced, I thought, at me. She looked, I thought, at me. I think she looked at me. She glanced, I thought, at me. Let us say good night, my fine boy, said the gentleman. When he had bent his head, I saw him over my mother's little glove. Good night, I said. Come, let us be the best of friends in the world, said the gentleman. Shake hands. My right hand was in my mother's left, so I gave him the other. Why, that's the wrong hand, Davy, laughed the gentleman. My mother drew my right hand forward, but I was resolved for my mother, for my mother drew my right hand forward, but I was resolved, for my former reason, not to give it to him, and I did not. I gave him the other, and he shook it heartily, and said I was a brave young fellow, and went away. Hearty. Hearty means, in a way, kind of means strong, or could mean like warm. Oh, let's see. Let's check the definition here. Hearty. I'm curious how they would define this. Loud, vigorous, cheerful, wholesome, substantial. Yeah, so something kind of strong, something good, something healthy. Hearty. Where do we have the word hearty here? He shook my hand heartily, so he was very enthusiastic about shaking my hand, and said I was a brave fellow, and went away. At this minute, I see him turn around in the garden and give us a last look with his what is that word? With his ill-omened black eyes. An omen is like a warning that something bad is going to happen. And an ill omen sounds like a very scary warning. So the man looked back at them as he was leaving, but what Davy could see is his evil eyes, kind of predicting something bad is in him, or something bad is coming because of him. Okay, and let's see, and said, I was a brave fellow, and went away. At this minute, I see him turn around in the garden, give us one last look with his ill-omened black eyes, before the door was shut. Peggotty, who has not said a word or moved a finger, secured the fastenings instantly, and we all went into the parlor. My mother, contrary to her usual habit, instead of coming to the elbow chair by the fire, remained at the other end of the room and sat singing to herself. Hope you had a pleasant evening, ma'am, said Peggotty, standing as stiff as a barrel in the center of the room with a candlestick in her hand. Much obliged to you, Peggotty, returned my mother in a cheerful voice. I had a very pleasant evening. A stranger so makes an agreeable change, suggested Peggotty. A very agreeable change indeed, returned my mother. Peggotty, continuing to stand motionless in the middle of the room, and my mother resuming her singing, I fell asleep, though I was not so sound asleep, but that I could hear voices without hearing what they said. When I half awoke from this uncomfortable doze, a doze is a kind of sleep, I found Peggotty and my mother both in tears and both talking. Not such a one as this, Mr. Copperfield wouldn't have liked, said Peggotty. That I say, and that I swear. There are a lot of negatives in that sentence. Not such a one as this, Mr. Copperfield wouldn't have liked. That sounds like he would like this man. So I wonder if Peggotty likes him. Good heavens, cried my mother, you'll drive me mad. Was ever any poor girl so ill used by her servants as I am? Oh no, so Peggotty obviously does not like this man. She's the servant and she's saying, this is a bad man, you shouldn't marry him. And the mother is saying, you're my servant, and how can you talk to me like this? Why do I do myself the injustice of calling myself a girl? Have I never been married, Peggotty? God knows you have, ma'am, returned Peggotty. Then how can you dare, said my mother. You know I don't mean how can you dare, Peggotty, but how can you have the heart to make me so uncomfortable and say such bitter things to me, when you are well aware that I haven't out of this place a single friend to turn to? So the mother is feeling a little bit lonely. She gave her this good news, I'm getting married to this man. Peggotty doesn't like it, and that hurts the mother quite a bit because she doesn't have any friends. Peggotty is her only friend. How can you be so aggravating, said my mother, shedding more tears than before, as to talk in such an unjust manner? How can you go on as if it was all settled and arranged, Peggotty, when I tell you over and over again, you cruel thing, that beyond the commonest civilities nothing has passed? You talk of admiration? What am I to do? If people are so silly as to indulge the sentiment, is it my fault? What am I to do? I ask you. Would you wish me to shave my head and black my face, or disfigure myself with a burn or a scald, or something of that sort? I dare say you would, Peggotty. I dare say you'd quite enjoy it. Peggotty seemed to take this aspersion very much at heart, I thought. And my dear boy, cried my mother, coming to the elbow chair at which I was, and caressing me, my own little Davy, is it to be hinted to me that I am wanting in affection for my precious treasure, the dearest little fellow that ever was? Nobody never went and hinted no such thing, said Peggotty. You did, Peggotty, returned my mother. You know you did. What else was it possible to infer from what you said, you unkind creature, when you know as well as I do that on his account, only last quarter, I wouldn't buy myself a new parasol, though that old green one is frayed the whole way up, and the fringe is perfectly mangy. You know it is, Peggotty. You can't deny it. And then turning affectionately to me with her cheek against mine. Am I a naughty mamma to you, Davy? Am I nasty, cruel, selfish, bad mamma? Say I am, my child. Say yes, dear boy. And Peggotty will love you. And Peggotty's love is a great deal better than mine, Davy. I don't love you at all, do I? At this, we all fell a-crying together. I think I was the loudest of the party, but I'm sure we were all sincere about it. I was quite heartbroken myself, and am afraid that in the first transports of wounded tenderness, I called Peggotty a beast. Oh no. That honest creature was in deep affliction, I remember, and must have become quite buttonless on the occasion. For a little volley of those explosives went off when, after having made it up with my mother, she kneeled down by the elbow chair and made it up with me. So she was so upset the buttons flew off her dress, and but eventually she apologized to the mother, and then she apologized to Davy. We went to bed greatly dejected. My sobs, remember, sob is like a word for crying. It's a loud crying. My sobs kept waking me up for a long time, and one very strong sob quite hoisted me from the bed. Hoisting is like lifting up. Let's see if we can find a word. Actually, here, let's put that word up on the screen. Hoist. My sobs kept waking me for a long time, and one very strong sob hoisted me up from the bed. And hoist, means lift. So when you think about the word hoist, you can think about things like this. That's something for hoisting. This is something for hoisting. Hoisting means, oh, I'm clicking on the wrong things here. Hoisting means lift. So his sobbing, his violent crying lifted him from bed, made him rise from the bed, hoisted him from the bed. Okay, so a strong sob quite hoisted me up in my bed. I found my mother sitting on the coverlet and leaning over me. I fell asleep in her arms after that and slept soundly. Whether it was the following Sunday when I saw the gentleman again, or whether there was any greater lapse of time before he reappeared, I cannot recall. I don't profess to be clear about dates, but there he was in church, and he walked home with us afterwards. He came in, too, to look at a famous geranium we had in the parlor window. A geranium is a type of flower. It did not appear to me that he took much notice of it, but before he went, he asked my mother to give him a bit of the blossom. She begged him to choose it for himself. So he wanted a little piece of the flower from the geranium. And she said, you go ahead and you pick which one you want. But he refused to do it. I could not understand why. So she plucked it for him and gave it into his hand. He said he should never part with it any more, and I thought he must be quite a fool not to know that it would fall to pieces in a day or two. Peggotty got to be less writhe with us. Peggotty began to be less with us of an evening than she had always been. My mother deferred to her very much, more than usual. It occurred to me that we were all three excellent friends. Still, we were different from what we used to be, and were not so comfortable among ourselves. Sometimes I fancied, remember that means imagined, sometimes I imagined, that Peggotty perhaps objected to my mother's wearing all the pretty dresses that she had in her drawers, or to her going so often to that neighbor's of an evening. But I couldn't, to my satisfaction, make out how it was. Gradually I became used to seeing the gentleman with the black whiskers. I liked him no better than at first, and I had some uneasy jealousy of him. But if I had any reason for it beyond a child's instinctive dislike, and a general idea that Peggotty and I could make such of my mother's without any help, I certainly was not the reason that I might have found. Oh, that's confusing. Let me try that again. Peggotty and I could make much of my mother without any help. It certainly was not the reason that I might have found if I had been older. But if I had any reason for it beyond a child's instinctive dislike, and a general idea that Peggotty and I could make much of my mother without any help, it certainly was not. That's confusing. I mean, I understand that what he's saying is he didn't understand why he didn't like this man. And if he had been older, I think it would have been more obvious to him why he didn't like the man. But that's a very confusing sentence, in my opinion. I could observe in little pieces, as it were, but as to making a net of a number of these pieces and catching anybody in it, that was as yet beyond me. One autumn morning I was with my mother in the front garden when Mr. Murdstone, I knew him by that name now, came by on horseback. He reined up his horse to salute my mother and said he was going to Lowestoft to see some. I want to center this more. To see some friends who were there with a yacht, and merrily proposed to take me on the saddle before him if I would like to ride. So he was going to see some friends in their boat, and he invited Davy to come with him on the horse. The air was so clear and pleasant, and the horse seemed to like the idea of the ride so much himself, as he stood snorting and pawing at the garden gate, that I had a great desire to go. So I was sent upstairs to Peggotty to be made spruce, and in the meantime Mr. Murdstone dismounted, and with his horse's bridle drawn over his arm, walked slowly up and down on the outer side of the sweetbriar fence, while my mother walked slowly up and down on the inner to keep him company. I recollect Peggotty and I peeping out at them from my little window. So remember, I think we had peep earlier, which is kind of like this. So peeping out. Maybe they were looking out the window to see what was happening. I recollect how closely they appeared to be examining the sweetbriar between them as they strolled along, and how from being in perfectly angelic temper, Peggotty got turned cross. Remember, cross means angry. Peggotty turned cross in a moment and brushed my hair the wrong way, excessively hard. So when she saw how friendly they were being with her, she was combing Davy's hair, but she got angry and started combing it very hard. Mr. Murdstone and I were soon off and trotting along on the green turf by the side of the road. He held me quite easily with one arm, and I don't think that I was restless usually, but I could not make up my mind to sit in front of him without turning my head sometimes and looking up in his face. He had that kind of shallow black eye. I want a better word to express an eye that has no depth in it to be looked into, which when it is abstracted seems from some peculiarity of light to be disfigured for a moment at a time by a cast. Oh, that's complicated. But he's just saying that man, he looks in his eyes, there's no light. It's just darkness. He has no soul in his eyes, and it freaked him out. Several times when I glanced at him, I observed that appearance with a sort of awe and wonder that he was thinking about so closely. His hair and whiskers were blacker and thicker, looked at so near than even I had given them credit for being. A squareness about the lower part of his face, and the dotted indication of a strong black beard he shaved closely every day, reminded me of the waxwork that had traveled into our neighborhood some half a year ago. This, his regular eyebrows, and the rich white and black and brown of his complexion, confound his complexion and his memory, made me think him, in spite of my misgivings, a very handsome man. I have no doubt that my poor dear mother thought him so too. So he's getting a close-up look at Mr. Murdstone's face, and he's realizing that he pays very close attention to how he looks. So he has the beard or the whiskers on his face, and they're very perfectly cut. They're not out of place at all. And he's a very attractive looking person. Even if Davy doesn't like him, he has to admit that he's an attractive man. We went to a hotel by the sea where two gentlemen were smoking cigars in a room by themselves. Each of them was lying on at least 4 chairs and had a large rough jacket on. In a corner was a heap of coats and boat cloaks and a flag, all bundled together. Now, the word heap is... Let me just put that up here. A heap. A heap is a pile of something. So, like for example, I mean, here they're talking about a heap of clothes, or a heap of coats. So let's say a heap of clothes and see what that looks like. Heap. So this is when you would use a heap. Heap just means pile, or like in Spanish they say mountain, montón, something like that. So this is a heap of clothes. And in the story, we have a heap of coats and boat cloaks and a flag, all bundled up together. So in the corner of that room where the two men were smoking their pipes, or cigars, they were smoking cigars, there was a heap of clothes. They both rolled up on their feet in an untidy sort of manner. When we came in, he said, "Hello, Murdstone. We thought you were dead." "Not yet," said Mr. Murdstone. "And who's this shaver?" said one of the gentlemen, taking hold of me. Shaver, that's like a word that you might use for a little boy. You might call him that, a little shaver. I don't know if people still use that term, but I remember that from when I was little. I don't hear people using it very much now. "That's Davy," returned Mr. Murdstone. "Davy? Davy who?" said the gentleman. "Jones?" I think Davy Jones was a pirate. "Copperfield," said Murdstone. "What?" "Bewitching. Mr. Copperfield's encumbrance." Encumbrance. Let's take a look at that word. Not a terribly important word that you need to know, but when you say, if you ever hear that word, it might be unencumbered. Let's put that up there. Unencumbered, the opposite. Unencumbered. Am I spelling that correctly? Let's see. Unencumbered. Unencumbered. Okay. So an encumbrance is something that is like an obstacle that stops you. And unencumbered means you have no obstacles at all. You're free to move. So an encumbrance is something that stops you from moving, stops you from progressing. So I wonder if they're calling Davy the encumbrance. Like, it's kind of a pain that Davy is with them. Because this word bewitching, I guess we better put that up here too. Bewitching. You probably recognize the word witch. Or maybe you know the old show from the 60s, Bewitched. That means like under the control of a witch. So if you're bewitched, you're under some kind of magical control. So maybe the two gentlemen were big and making jokes, and Davy was so distracted by that he didn't notice anything else. It's kind of like being under a magic control. So bewitching Mr. Murdstone's encumbrance. So Davy, maybe they see him as an inconvenience, but he was bewitched by them. If that makes any sense. Okay, let's see. Copperfield, said Mr. Murdstone. What? Bewitching Mr. Copperfield's encumbrance? Cried the gentleman. The pretty little widow? Oh, Mrs. Copperfield's encumbrance. Bewitching Mr. Okay, sorry, now I understand the phrase. Bewitching Mrs. Copperfield. So Mrs. Copperfield, Davy's mother, she's so beautiful. Oh, let's put bewitched back up here. So remember, bewitching means being under magic control, a magical control. So when they say bewitching Mrs. Copperfield, what they mean is she's so beautiful that when you see her, you are under the control of her. She gives magic. So you're distracted by her. And when they say bewitching Mrs. Copperfield's encumbrance, they're talking about Davy. Davy is an inconvenience to this woman because most people wouldn't like to marry a woman who already has a son. So it's something preventing her from living her life. That's how they see Davy. Bewitching Mrs. Copperfield's encumbrance. She's such a beautiful woman, but he's really an inconvenience for her. That's how they see it. The pretty little widow? Quignon. What is that? Quignon. Why are they saying quignon? Is that a French word or meaning? 5 sheets folded and gathered. It's from the classical Latin quini, 5 cents, 5 each. I don't understand this sentence. Quignon, said Mr. Murdstone. Take care, if you please. Somebody's sharp. Uh-oh, I had a little break in my internet service. I think it's back. So I think that this quignon is like a phrase, like a code, a secret code or something like that. And then he says, take care if you please. Somebody's sharp. Somebody's very smart. Somebody understands everything you're talking about. And the gentlemen laugh and they say, who? Who here is smart? Kind of making a joke. Only Brooks of Sheffield, said Mr. Murdstone. Okay. I was quite relieved to find it was only Brooks of Sheffield. For at first, I really thought it was I. That's what I thought too, Davy. I don't know who Brooks of Sheffield is. Okay, let's see. Maybe I don't understand what's going on here. Let's see. There seemed to be something very comical in the reputation of Mr. Brooks of Sheffield, for both of the gentlemen laughed heartily. Remember, heartily means like strong or happy or healthy. So they gave big laughs when Mr. Brooks of Sheffield was mentioned. When he was mentioned, and Mr. Murdstone was a good deal amused also. After some laughing, the gentleman whom he had called Quignon, oh, so that's somebody's name. You see, I have no idea what's going on here. Said, and what is the opinion of Brooks of Sheffield in reference to the projected business? Why, I don't know that Brooks understands much about it at present, replied Mr. Murdstone. But he's not generally favorable, I believe. There was one more laughter at this point, and Mr. Quignon said he would ring the bell for some sherry in which to drink to Brooks. This he did, and when the wine came, he made me have a little with a biscuit, and before I drank it, stand up and say, "Confusion to Brooks of Sheffield." Confusion to Brooks of Sheffield. So when Davy had the wine, they made him say that. Confusion to Brooks of Sheffield. There's some kind of joke here that I don't understand. The toast was received with great applause and such hearty laughter. Again, hearty means very strong, very healthy, very big. So, and with such hearty laughter that it made me laugh too, at which they laughed even more. So I think they're playing some kind of mean joke with Davy and this Brooks of Sheffield character. But let's see. In short, we quite enjoyed ourselves. We walked about the cliff after that and sat on the grass and looked at things through a telescope. I could make out nothing myself. Let's put that word up here, to make something out. To make something out means to distinguish something. So, imagine if you're looking into a telescope, and things are very far away. It might be hard to find details, or to look at something and say, "Oh, that's a rock," or that's a person. If it's so far away, it's difficult to make those distinctions. So when you say you can make something out, that means you can find it, you can see it among the other things. All right, so here we walked about on the cliff after that and sat on the grass and looked at things through a telescope. I could make out nothing myself when it was put to my eye. So he could see things, but he couldn't look at something and say, "Oh, that's a rock," or that's a person. Things were too far away to understand what they were exactly. But I pretended that I could. And then we came back to the hotel to an early dinner. All the time we were out with the two gentlemen smoked incessantly. Incessant means it never stops. Which I thought, if I might judge from the smell of their rough coats, they must have been doing ever since the coats had first come from the tailor's. So the coats smelled like smoke so much that it seems like they must have been smoking non-stop since they got the coats. I must not forget that we went on board the yacht where they all three descended into the cabin and were busy with some papers. I saw them quite hard at work when I looked down through the open skylight. They left me during this time with a very nice man with a large head of red hair and a very small shiny hat upon it. And he got a cross-barred shirt or waistcoat with skylark in capital letters across the chest. I thought that was his name, and that he lived on board the ship and hadn't a street door to put his name on. He put it on there instead. But when I called him Mr. Skylark, he said it meant the vessel, so Skylark was the name of the boat that they were on. I observed all day that Mr. Murdstone was graver and steadier than the two gentlemen. Grave means serious. They were very gay and careless. They joked freely with one another. Gay just means happy, so they were very happy and careless. So they were laughing and joking, but Mr. Murdstone was always very serious looking, very grave looking. They joked freely with one another, but seldom with him. It appeared to me that he was more clever and cold than they were, and that they regarded him with something of my own feeling. So he has this idea that maybe those two men who were joking had the same feeling of uneasiness, of uncomfortableness around Mr. Murdstone. So it wasn't just Davy who didn't like him, it was everybody. I remarked that once or twice when Mr. Quignon was talking, he looked at Mr. Murdstone sideways, as if to make sure he's not being displeased, and that once Mr. Jag, the other gentleman, was in high spirits, he trod upon his foot and gave him a secret caution with his eyes to observe Mr. Murdstone, who was sitting stern and silent. Stern is another word that means very serious. Nor do I recollect that Mr. Murdstone laughed at all that day, except at the Sheffield joke, and that, by the by, was his own. By the by, that's kind of a way of saying by the way. I don't know if people say that anymore. My mother used to say that. I don't really hear people saying that very much, though. Maybe that's an old expression. We went home early in the evening. It was a very fine evening. And my mother and he had another stroll by the Sweetbriar while I was sent to get my tea. Stroll is a word for walk. It's another word for walking. And just so you know, let me just get a picture here. These are called strollers, because this is how you take a baby for a walk. You put the baby in the stroller and then you can go for a stroll. Stroll is another word for going for a walk. Stroll sounds like a nice walk, a nice little walk, a walk for fun. Okay, let's see. When he was gone, my mother asked me all about the day I had had and what they had said and done. I mentioned what they had said about her, and she laughed and told me that they were impudent fellows who talked nonsense. But I knew it pleased her when they called her bewitching. I don't know about the encumbrance part, which would be the Davy part. That isn't very nice. I don't think the mother should be laughing at that. I knew it was quite as well as I know it now. I took the opportunity of asking if she was at all acquainted with Mr. Brooks of Sheffield, but she answered no, only she supposed he must be a manufacturer in the knife and fork way. Can I say to her face, altered as I have reason to remember it, perished as I know it is, that it is gone, when here it comes before me at this instant, as distinct as any face that I may choose to look on in a crowded street? Can I say of her innocent and girlish beauty that it faded and was no more when its breath falls on my cheek now as it fell that night? Can I say she ever changed when my remembrance brings her back to life, thus only, and truer to its loving youth than I have been, or man, it's hard to read this, or man ever is, still holds fast what it cherished then? Oh, that's some pretty poetic writing. So I guess he's kind of preparing us for all of her beauty disappearing instantly. And he's saying, can I even remember how she was before this terrible thing happened to her? What was it they said, Davy? Tell me again. I can't believe it. Bewitching, I began. Remember, bewitching means that she can do magic. She has magical control over people because she has bewitching beauty. She's so beautiful that it gives her magical control over them. My mother put her hands upon her lips to stop me. It was never bewitching, she said, laughing. It never could have been bewitching Davy. Now I know it wasn't. Yes, it was. Bewitching Mrs. Copperfield, I repeated stoutly. And pretty. So she was saying, no, they of course they didn't call me bewitching. And he's saying, yes, they did. I'm sure of it. No, no. It was never pretty, not pretty, interposed my mother, laying her fingers on her lips again. Yes, it was. Pretty little widow. What foolish, impudent creatures, cried my mother, laughing and covering her face. What ridiculous men. Ain't they, Davy dear? Well, Ma, don't tell Peggotty. She might be angry with them. I'm dreadfully angry with them myself. But I would rather Peggotty didn't know. I promised, of course, and we kissed one another over and over, and I soon fell asleep. It seems to me at this distance of time as if it were the next day when Peggotty broached the striking and adventurous preposition I am about to mention, but it was probably about 2 months afterwards. We were sitting as before one evening when my mother was out as before, in the company with stocking and the yard measure and a bit of wax, and the box with St. Paul's on the lid, and the crocodile book, when Peggotty, after looking at me several times and opening her mouth, as if she were going to speak without doing it, which I thought was merely gaping. Remember, gaping is when you have your mouth open. So she kept trying to say something, but she stopped, and he thought it was gaping, but it was really her trying to say something that she couldn't say. Or I should have been rather alarmed, said coaxingly, Master Davy, how would you like to go along with me and spend a fortnight at my brother's at Yarmouth? Wouldn't that be a treat? A fortnight is 14 nights, or 2 weeks. Is your brother an agreeable man, Peggotty? I inquired provisionally. Oh, what an agreeable man he is, cried Peggotty, holding up her hands. Then there's the sea, and the boats, and the ships, and the fishermen, and the beach, and to play with, aim to play with. Am to play with. I don't know what that am is. Maybe we'll find out. Peggotty meant her nephew. So she's saying Ham. Her nephew's name is Ham, but some people, especially in the UK, don't pronounce H's very much. So instead of saying Ham, she's saying am. Am to play with. Peggotty meant her nephew Ham, mentioned in my first chapter, but she spoke of him as a morsel of English grammar. First person singular, present tense indicative, verb neuter, to be. I was flushed by her summary of delights and replied that it would indeed be a treat. But what would my mother say? Well, then I'll bet as good as a guinea. I'll bet as good as I'll as good as bet a guinea. Why? Then I'll as good as bet a guinea. A guinea is a coin, it's some type of currency in Victorian England. Why? Then I'll bet as I can't say that phrase. Why? Then I'll as good as a bet a guinea, said Peggotty, intent upon my face. So intent upon my face, looking at me very carefully, looking at my face very carefully, that she'll let us go. I'll ask her, if you like, as soon as ever she comes home. There now. But what's she to do while we're away? I said, putting my small elbows on the table to argue the point. She can't live by herself. If Peggotty were looking for a hole, all of a sudden, in the heel of that stocking, it must have been a very little one indeed, and not worth darning. So she's fixing her stockings, and Davy asks this question, and she doesn't know how to answer it. So suddenly she's really concentrating on the stocking. I say, Peggotty, she can't live by herself, you know. Oh, bless you, said Peggotty, looking at me again at last. Don't you know? She's going to stay for a fortnight with Mrs. Graper. Mrs. Graper is going to have a lot of company. Oh, if that was it, I was quite ready to go. I waited in the utmost impatience until my mother came home from Mrs. Graper's, for it was that identical neighbor, to ascertain if we could get leave to carry out this great idea. Without being nearly so much surprised as I had expected, my mother entered into it readily, and it was all arranged that night, and my board and lodging during the visit were to be paid for. When you see board in this way, it means food. So Davy was receiving room and board at Peggotty's brother's house, and the mother was going to pay for it. And board just means food, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The day soon came for our going, and it was such an early day that it came soon, even to me, who was in a fever of expectation, and half afraid that an earthquake or a fiery mountain or some other great convulsion of nature might interpose to stop the expedition. So he was so excited that he was afraid that there would be a storm or some kind of horrible weather that would stop them. We were to go in a carrier's cart, which departed in the morning after breakfast. I would have given any money to have been allowed to wrap myself up overnight and sleep in my hat and boots. We were to go in a carrier's cart, which departed in the morning after breakfast. I would have given any money to have been allowed to wrap myself up overnight and sleep in my hat. So I think he was saying, sometimes this is hard to, even for me, this is my language, but it's hard to understand what they mean. But I think what that means is he would have preferred to leave that night instead of waiting for the morning, and he wouldn't have minded sleeping in the cart, the horse cart that would take them there. I'm glad to recollect that when the carrier's cart was at the gate, and my mother stood there kissing me, a grateful fondness for her and for the old place I had never turned my back upon before made me cry. Fondness. Let's read that again and look at the word fondness. I'm glad to recollect that when the carrier's cart was at the gate, my mother stood there kissing me. A grateful fondness for her and for the old place I had never turned my back upon before made me cry. So this word fondness, usually you see the word fond, it means like. I like something, I don't like something. It's kind of a polite way of saying like. But fondness here kind of means like love, like a deep liking feeling for his mother and for the home that he had never left. You see, he never turned his back on his home. It made him cry when he left because that was the first time he was leaving that house. He never realized what a deep feeling he had for his mother and for that house until he left. I'm glad to know that my mother cried too, and that I felt her heart beat against mine. I'm glad to recollect that when the carrier began to move, my mother ran out at the gate and called to him to stop, that she might kiss me once more. I'm glad to dwell upon the earnestness and love with which she lifted up her face to mine, and did so. To dwell upon something. That's a useful phrase. This phrase, to dwell upon, maybe you've never seen this word dwell before, which means live. As a matter of fact, another word for house is, or a place where you live, is dwelling, because that's where you live. So it's called a dwelling. But when you dwell upon something, that means when you think about something, when you concentrate on it. almost obsessed with the idea of something. So he says, I'm glad to dwell upon the earnestness and love. Forget the word earnestness for right now. I'm glad to dwell upon the love with which she lifted up her face to mine. So he kind of obsesses. That picture is in his head all the time. He dwells upon it. He's obsessed with it. He thinks about it all the time. And that makes him happy. So it's not really a problem here. Usually we dwell upon negative feelings or negative things. But here Davy is dwelling upon a happy memory. As we left her standing there in the road, Mr. Murdstone came up to where she was and seemed to expostulate with her for being so moved. Expostulate. Let's look that up. I don't know what that is. Expostulate. These are not, you'll never use this word in your life. But let's see. Disapprove. So Mr. Murdstone didn't like this scene of her being sad and Davy leaving and her crying, so he was disapproving of it. I was looking back round the awning of the cart and wondered what business it was of his. So why does he disapprove? Why does he care about that? That's none of his business. Peggotty, who was also looking back on the other side, seemed anything but satisfied, as the face she brought back into the cart denoted. I sat looking at Peggotty for some time in a reverie on a supposititious. Let's see what that is. Again, this is not a word that you ever have to know. I don't even know it. Supposititious. Substitution, not genuine. Okay, I sat looking at Peggotty for some time in a reverie on this supposititious case. I'm not sure what that sentence is about. A case could be like a suitcase or a chest, but why would he say that it's not genuine? It's not real. Okay, well, I don't know. Case can also mean situation, but I still don't understand what is meant by that. Okay, whether if she were employed to lose me like the boy in the fairy tale, I should be able to track my way home again by the buttons that she would shed. So remember when Peggotty gets upset and she moves, the buttons pop off of her shirt and they fly everywhere. But he's saying, well, if I get lost, the way I can find my way home is by picking up the buttons, following the buttons back to the house. That's pretty funny. Okay. Well, this is the end of chapter 2. So we'll stop here. Probably I'll do another chapter tomorrow, and then we'll have like an enormous amount of vocabulary to do little exercises with. And I'll probably do those in a few days. So make sure you watch out for these because, so yes, we've gone through the reading of the chapter and we've highlighted some words and learned a little bit more about them. But I'm also going to be putting up exercises on my channel where you can play around with the words a little bit and get used to using them and become more comfortable with them. So that's really the great part about this, not just reading through the book, but also learning and practicing and using the words. All right. Well, I think it's time to go now, and I will see you next time with Chapter 3 of Charles Dickens' David Copperfield.